The air was thick with the stench of swamp rot and dusty concrete as I stood at the boundary of what once was my backyard, watching Karen from the HOA loudly berate a city inspector while her pristine, nearly new McMansion slowly sank deeper into the muck. Flash flood warnings echoed from idling squad cars nearby. Frogs croaked from the front yards, and somewhere across this swampy nightmare, a rusty mailbox floated past like a mournful funeral barge. Yeah, that's me. You're probably wondering how things spiraled into this mess. I never imagined that a narrow creek winding through my backyard would ignite a full-blown battle, but that's exactly what happened. For years, that small stream was my sanctuary, my reward after grueling days welding pipes and crawling beneath houses. I'd settle into a battered folding chair beside the creek, a beer in one hand and a fishing pole in the other. Though the biggest catch I ever landed was a curious bluegill, dragonflies darted through the tall reeds, the air smelled of damp grass, and the only sound at night was the soft murmur of water threading through rocks. It was a peaceful spot you just didn't mess with. Then the HOA arrived. Technically, the HOA had been established years ago on the far side of the development, tucked away behind rows of identical beige houses, matching mailboxes, and oddly synchronized porch pumpkins every October. We Creekside folks were the old guard of the leftovers from when this land was just fields and dirt roads. But boundaries shifted, neighborhoods got redrawn, and before we even noticed, the HOA crept into our lives like an oil spill. My first encounter with their nonsense was on a muggy Saturday morning when Karen Mitchell showed up on my porch, clutching a clipboard like a medieval shield. She wore pastel workout clothes that screamed not a workout, and her smile was about as warm as a tax audit. She introduced herself as the HOA's Community Standards Chair. I introduced myself as busy, but that didn't deter her. She had complaints about my property, specifically, my creek. According to her, this unauthorized water feature was a serious safety hazard to neighborhood kids and wildlife. I looked at her like she'd just accused my cat of running a scam. The creek was natural long before any of us moved in with our mortgages and zero-turn mowers. It belonged to the land as much as the trees and rocks. Karen didn't care. She had rules about fencing, water features, standing water, aesthetics, rules. I politely told her the creek was protected by natural drainage laws per my deed and county regulations. She just scribbled furiously on her clipboard, huffed, and stomped away, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and pure fury. 2 days later, I found a violation notice taped to my door, accusing me of unauthorized landscaping, unsafe open water, and attracting non-native species. So apparently, frogs were now considered invaders. I ignored it. A week later came a second notice, threatening $100 fines per day unless I submitted a plan to fix my property. I responded with a simple letter quoting county codes and attached a land survey confirming the creek's status. They replied by scheduling a mandatory inspection. 3 strangers I'd never seen before showed up in my backyard, measuring, snapping photos with their phones like they were gathering evidence for a criminal trial. Karen hovered on the edge of my property, tapping her foot impatiently as I stood arms crossed, daring them to step 1 inch into the creek itself. They didn't, but took plenty of notes. A week later, at the mandatory HOA meeting I had no plans to attend, Karen stood before a mostly bored crowd and declared my creek an imminent safety threat, citing insurance risks, wildlife attraction, mosquito breeding, and possible erosion endangering nearby homes. The irony of calling a natural creek a hazard in a swampy neighborhood was apparently lost on her. When I stood up to argue, she smiled sweetly and handed me a packet demanding I either fence off the creek, fill it in, or submit to weekly HOA inspections at my expense for the next year. I told Hera and the whole room exactly where they could put their paperwork. Politely, of course. After that, things only got worse. Anonymous complaints about my overgrown yard and property upkeep began appearing on my door every few days. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked off its post. One morning, someone dumped a pile of landscaping rocks into the shallow creek, causing water to back up and pull against the banks. One afternoon, I caught Karen herself taking pictures of my yard from inside her SUV across the street, engine running like some suburban spy. I refused to give in. I kept the creek wild, trimmed the reeds, kept the water flowing. It was my land, my water, and my right to enjoy it in peace. But I should have known they wouldn't stop there. One early Wednesday morning, as I sipped coffee on the back porch, I heard the low rumble of heavy machinery. At first, I thought it was city workers fixing potholes down on Maple Drive, but the noise grew louder, closer. I stood just in time to see a small cement truck backing down the alley between my house and my neighbor's. A man in a neon vest and hard hat guided the truck like it was a Ferrari, shouting to the driver over the engine's roar. I sprinted down there. As they stepped across the yard and positioned the chute right over the upper bend of my creek, I shouted, waving my arms, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The guy in the vest barely glanced at me. "Just following work orders, sir." Drainage mitigation project approved by the HOA. Before I could get another word out, the chute swung down and a thick grey slurry of wet concrete poured into the creek. I lost it. I lunged forward but slipped on the muddy grass, falling hard onto my side and scraping my arm. By the time I scrambled back up, the cement was already spreading like a toxic sludge, coating the pebbles, drowning the reeds, suffocating the water itself. Frogs leapt desperately away, but some were caught too late, trapped and doomed in the drying mess. The driver kept the mixer drum turning, casually filling the entire upper bend with thick grey goo while the vested man checked his clipboard and nodded in approval. I screamed for them to stop, demanded to see paperwork, told them to get off my land, but they ignored me. When they finally finished and drove off, my beautiful creek had been transformed into a grotesque scar of concrete. A silent, lifeless ditch stretching from one end of the yard to the other. A slow fury settled deep in my bones as I stood there, dripping mud and blood, staring at the smoking wreckage of what had once been the heart and soul of my home. Karen watched from the sidewalk, arms crossed, smiling like she'd just won a chess match I didn't even know we were playing. I wiped the mud from my eyes, stood tall, and smiled right back. Let her have this round. She had no idea what kind of storm she'd just unleashed. The first rain after the summer drought was almost a relief. A heavy grey sheet rolled in from the west, drenching the baked streets of our neighborhood with a cool flood of water. I sat on my porch watching it come, arms crossed, coffee growing cold in my hands as thick raindrops hammered the roof and turned the lawn into a muddy sponge. Normally, the creek would have handled this easily, its little gurgling mouth swallowing runoff and carrying it downstream like it had for decades before any of us moved in. But this time, there was no creek to catch the water, only a long, hard, slick concrete scar, useless. I watched as the rainwater hit the concrete channel, swirled uncertainly, then began to back up, pulling across the lawn and into low spots like an old man trying to find his way home. Within an hour, puddles stretched across my backyard like ugly grey bruises. By noon, the sidewalk out front was ankle-deep in murky runoff, mulch and trash spinning in lazy circles where storm drains clogged. Across the street, Karen Mitchell stood on her porch beneath an umbrella the size of a beach tent, watching with thin-lipped satisfaction as water lapped at curbs and flower beds. It only took 2 storms for serious problems to start. Mrs. Jensen, at the corner house, woke to find her basement carpet squishing beneath her feet. Mr. Alvarez had to sandbag his front door as a river of runoff poured down the slope of his yard straight toward his porch. Gutters on Maple Drive overflowed so badly that the entire cul-de-sac turned into a stagnant pond, trapping a couple of cars up to their wheel wells in dirty brown soup. And every single time, the HOA sent out notices blaming the homeowners, improper lawn grading, clogged personal drains, failure to maintain property water runoff according to HOA standards. Never once did Karen or her cronies admit that by pouring concrete into the natural drainage path, They had crippled the whole runoff system. It was as if the creek had never existed, wiped from their memories like an inconvenient footprint erased at a crime scene. I said nothing publicly. I attended meetings, nodded politely when they showed satellite photos with red circles marking problem spots, watched as they passed emergency measures requiring mandatory property drainage inspections, conveniently costing $250 per household. I played the fool, but inside I was documenting everything. Every storm, I walked the neighborhood with my old Nikon camera around my neck, pretending to be a hobbyist photographer while quietly snapping hundreds of pictures. Flooded yards, submerged mailboxes, water pooling in the newly landscaped common areas. I kept a detailed notebook of dates, times, locations, notes about which homes were worst affected. I even dusted off my old drone after big storms, capturing aerial shots of the water's flow, or rather, its failure to flow. No one else seemed to notice. They were too busy bickering. As the flooding worsened, so did the tension between neighbors. Mrs. Jensen accused the Alvarez kids of blocking a storm drain with a soccer ball. The Hendersons blamed the Patels for installing a flower bed that supposedly redirected runoff onto their lawn. Neighbors who once shared beers and barbecue recipes now filed formal complaints against each other, accusing deliberate water mismanagement. The whole leaned into the chaos. They appointed Karen to lead a new flood mitigation task force, which mostly involved her writing harsher violation letters and pushing through emergency fines with 0 homeowner votes. Meanwhile, the drainage infrastructure rotted under the strain. The few storm drains we had were never designed to handle all the runoff without the natural creek doing its part, and they choked under the storms like a man trying to breathe through a straw. Streets cracked, lawns washed away, mold crept up garage doors, and still, somehow, the blame always fell on the residents. One neighbor muttered. One morning, I overheard a neighbor muttering bitterly at the mailbox that maybe Karen ought to find herself for not controlling the weather. The sarcasm in the air was thicker than the floodwaters themselves. I said nothing. I just nodded sympathetically and slipped another batch of printed photos into my growing file of evidence. It wasn't just the water rising, it was resentment, a thick, ugly, building pressure beneath the surface of our neat neighborhood, like steam trapped under a cracked kettle lid. You could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact at home meetings, the way whispered conversations stopped dead when certain board members walked by. And Karen thrived on it. She strutted around wearing her HOA badge like a sheriff's star, savoring every new complaint, every fine she levied against homes she disliked. One afternoon, she even made a special visit to my door, wearing a fake smile, to inform me that due to ongoing drainage problems, I was now required to submit a full landscaping plan for review by the end of the month. I asked if the plan needed to account for the literal concrete wall they had poured onto my property without permission. She blinked slowly and said that any changes to existing drainage structures would risk further fines. I signed the paperwork with a smile, took the official-looking form, and added it to my ever-growing binder of ammunition. Let them bury themes, Sylvester. I was patient. I had time, and I knew something they didn't. Nature doesn't forget. Water doesn't forgive. And concrete, for all its smug permanence, can't withstand the unstoppable persistence of rain and gravity forever. It wouldn't be long now. The cracks were already showing, if you knew where to look. I saw it in Mr. Alvarez's retaining wall, sinking slowly but surely, in the puddle at the base of the Hendersons' driveway that never quite dried up, in the way Mrs. Jensen's front lawn had started to tilt suspiciously toward the street. After the last big storm, the earth was moving at first imperceptibly, like a cat shifting weight before a pouncier, but moving nonetheless. All because they had tried to pave over something that was never meant to be controlled. I kept my head down, my mouth shut, and my camera batteries charged, because it wasn't just me, Anna Maria, they wronged all of us. And when the dam finally broke, I intended to have a front row seat. The third week of rain began softly, like a drum roller, a faint whisper against the window panes. Then it gathered strength, swelling into a full-throated roar that blackened the skies and filled the air with the scent of wet earth and ozone. Weather reports flashed warnings on every station, calling it a 100-year storm, a freak convergence of cold fronts and saturated ground. But here in the neighborhood, it felt like Judgment Day. The streets turned into rivers overnight. Asphalt vanished beneath swirling grey currents flecked with sodden shredded mulch. Manhole covers erupted brown geysers into the air. Gutters ripped free from houses with sharp metallic groans. Water overwhelmed the flimsy construction. Lawns disappeared beneath dirty lakes that shimmered under streetlights like oil on glass. And the houses, so God help them, the houses began to crack. It started small hairline fractures spidering across driveways and walkways, easy to ignore if you squinted or chalked it up to settling. But then the real damage surfaced. Long jagged fissures climbed stucco walls like lightning scars. Door frames warped until front doors refused to latch. Garage floors buckled as the earth shifted beneath them. I watched it all unfold from my porch at the same folding chair, the same battered thermos of coffee, a silent witness as nature reclaimed what it was owed. Across the street, Karen Mitchell stood ankle-deep in water, screaming into her cell phone, gesturing wildly at the lake that had swallowed her prize-winning rose bushes and was now licking the steps of her front porch. Her perfect suburban utopia was dissolving into a swamp, and she couldn't stop it. She tried. Of course. The hosts scrambled like ants from a kicked nest to emergency meetings at the community center, sandbags handed out from the back of a rented U-Haul, urgent emails blaming everything from clogged city drains to unusually high tides. They brought in a landscaping company that specialized in rapid water remediation, which mostly meant dumping gravel into the worst puddles and hoping for the best. Karen herself led a campaign accusing the city of negligence, filing complaints, threatening lawsuits, ranting about how their tax dollars entitled them to better drainage systems. But the truth hung heavy and unspoken because anyone with eyes could see where the problem had started. It began where the creek had once been. It started in my backyard. And so, naturally, the blame shifted again. First whispered among the HOA board during emergency sessions, then surfaced in passive-aggressive emails sent to all residents. Finally, Karen made it official. She marched up to my porch one afternoon with a clipboard and a violation notice thicker than a phone book. Negligent property maintenance, failure to install proper drainage structures, contribution to neighborhood flooding. Her voice trembled with barely contained fury as she read the accusations aloud, water still dripping from the hem of her designer raincoat. I listened patiently, sipping my coffee, nodding at all the right moments, letting her vent every ounce of frustration, fear, and rage. I said almost nothing, signed nothing, just smiled at that slow smile that made her eyes narrow with suspicion, because I knew something she didn't. I'd known it for weeks, sitting quietly on the truth like a trapdoor spider, waiting for the right moment. They thought they had erased the creek with a few yards of concrete and some paperwork. But creeks are real. Creeks are stubborn things. They're etched deep into the land's bones, written far deeper than any human survey or HOA covenant. The water hadn't vanished, it had just gone underground, seeping slowly through the soil, tracing its old paths, saturating the earth layer by layer until it could no longer be ignored. The foundations weren't cracking just because of clogged drains or heavy rain alone. They were cracking because the earth itself was shifting, swollen with trapped water, pushing against the unnatural barriers humans had foolishly thrown up. And I had the proof. Tucked away in my files were drone photos showing the early signs of pooling, aerial maps tracing the slow, inevitable migration of water toward the lower-lying homes, city floodplain maps that had never been updated after the HOA's illegal creek alterations, and even a few discreet recordings from contractors and surveyors confirming off the record that the HOA's changes violated several county drainage codes. But I wasn't ready to spring the trap yet. No. This had to get worse. It had to hurt. It had to break them. And judging by the rising tension in the neighborhood, we were close. You could feel it, like the electric hum before a thunderstorm, in the way neighbors shot angry glares across flooded sidewalks, in the sharp, rising voices at home meetings, and in the once perfect lawns now sagging under the weight of mud and resentment. Karen felt it too. She doubled down on new regulations, new fines, new inspections. She organized a neighborhood improvement committee tasked with identifying homes contributing to the community's aesthetic decline. And guess whose name was at the top of that list? I smiled when the notice arrived at 3 pages of vague accusations and thinly veiled threats. I added it to my growing binder, carefully slipping a copy into a waterproof container buried beneath the old oak tree out back just in case. Because people like Karina, once they feel the ground slipping beneath them, get desperate. And desperate people make big mistakes. All I had to do was wait. The land itself would do the heavy lifting. It was already happening. You could see it in sagging door frames, bowed fences, cracked retaining walls. You could hear it in the nervous chatter at the coffee shop, the whispered gossip by the mailboxes, and the for sale signs popping up faster than mushrooms after a storm. The neighborhood was rotting from the inside out, just like Karen's paper empire of rules and fines. And still, somehow, she thought she could fix it by forcing me into submission. She thought this was about me. That was her fatal mistake. This wasn't about me, it was about the land, about the water, about forces far older, stronger, and infinitely more patient than she could ever understand. And soon enough, she was going to learn that lesson the hard way. The heavy envelope had sat at the bottom of my filing cabinet for years, tucked between yellowed manuals and a cracked box of Christmas lights I'd never hung. I found it the night after Karen dropped the latest violation notice on my doorstep, her smug grin still fresh in my mind. That night, pure stubbornness drove me into the garage, flashlight clenched between my teeth, rifling through old boxes until I found the battered blue folder my grandfather had given me when he signed over the property. Might be useful someday, he'd said, then promptly refused to explain. I pried the envelope open with the edge of a screwdriver and found a treasure trove inside. Original land surveys dating back to 1952. A certified letter from the County Water Authority dated 1978 confirming a permanent natural drainage easement running right through what was now my backyard. Copies of state environmental protection orders recognizing the creek as part of a protected watershed. In other words, a hard, official proof that my little creek wasn't just a pretty feature, but a legally protected drainage route. One that no homeowners association, no matter how drunk on power, had the right to fill in, block, reroute, or tamper with. And that was exactly what they'd done when they poured concrete into it. I sank back against the cold concrete floor. Documents spread like a winning hand before me, and let out a long, slow breath. They'd screwed up royally, but proving it would take more than waving these papers around at the next home meeting. I needed the right people to see them. People with badges, people with clipboards, people who could shut Karen down like a dam shutting a river. So I made some calls. First, to the County Water Authority, requesting a property inspection due to suspected unauthorized modification of natural drainage systems. Then to the City Environmental Office, framing it as a potential wetland violation. And I used my real name. I gave my real property details but carefully left out any mention of the half an hour let them find the smoking gun themselves. While the bureaucratic wheels slowly began to turn, I moved on to the second part of my plan, anonymous whistleblowing. It was surprisingly easy. A burner email account, a carefully crafted message explaining the situation, complete with aerial drone photos, time-stamped pictures of the concrete pour, copies of the old easement documents, and links to county code violations. I sent it to every local news station, the city newspaper, a few popular suburban Facebook groups, and just for fun, the HOA gossip forum that Karen had banned me from last year. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, a white county truck rolled slowly down my street, followed by a second vehicle bearing the city seal. 2 inspectors got out, one carrying a clipboard, the other shoulder deep with what looked like a surveyor's tripod. They crunched across the muddy sidewalk, carefully avoiding flooded yards, and came straight to my front door. I invited them in, offered coffee, and calmly laid out the entire history, backed by hard evidence. They listened, asked pointed questions, then spent the next 4 hours meticulously inspecting the creek area and measuring the concrete fill, taking soil samples, snapping photos from every angle. I watched from my porch as they made notes, conferred quietly, frowned a lot, and finally shook their heads grimly before getting back into their trucks. Later that night, the first news story hit to a short segment on the evening news. Grainy aerial shots showed our neighborhood floating on a lake of muddy water, while the reporter explained that unauthorized modifications to natural drainage systems had worsened flooding and possibly violated multiple environmental protections. They didn't name the HOA yet, but it was only a matter of time. The next morning, I found a certified letter jammed into my mailbox, an official notice of investigation addressed to the HOA. Of course, Karen already knew. The way she stormed into the emergency board meeting that afternoon told me everything. I stayed just long enough to watch her march to the podium, her cheeks flushed, hair frizzed from the rain, and slam a thick stack of papers down in front of the stunned board members. She ranted about slander, false accusations, rogue residents sabotaging the community. She accused the county of overreach, the city of corruption, the media of bias, everyone but herself. Behind her, the projector screen flickered to life, showing images pulled straight from the whistleblower packet, photos of the concrete trucks pouring into the creek, maps of the natural easement running through my property, screenshots of violated county codes highlighted in bold red text. The room went silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Even the board members, usually quick to nod along with Karen, shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting everywhere but at her. She was cornered, and she knew it. But Karen was nothing if not stubborn. She doubled down and claimed the concrete was just temporary erosion control, insisted the HOA had the right to beautify common areas, even hinted she had verbal permission from someone at the county. But when one quieter board member timidly asked for written proof, Karen's mouth snapped shut like a steel trap. There was none here, and she knew it. That night, the second wave of news coverage hit, and this time it was harsher. Words like illegal, reckless, and potential civil and criminal penalties were thrown around with relish. Several residents were interviewed, some on camera, expressing outrage, fears about property values, and concerns about mold and foundation damage. A local environmental watchdog group picked up the story and started circulating a petition demanding a full investigation and restitution for affected homeowners. Within a week, the county posted official violation notices on the community center doors. City inspectors began knocking on doors, and not to issue HOA fines, but to conduct property inspections related to flooding and foundation damage. Lawsuits started brewing in the background. Rumors spread like wildfire that several homeowners were planning to sue both the HOA and individual board members for negligence and property damage. At the center of the storm stood Karen, desperately trying to plug leaks in a ship already halfway underwater. She tried rallying her loyalists of the few die-hard rule followers who still believed in HOA governance. But their numbers dwindled with every soggy basement and cracked wall. She tried to spin the narrative, claiming victimhood, alleging conspiracies. But nobody was buying it anymore. Neighbors who once nodded along to her tirades now crossed the street to avoid her. Board meetings once packed with sycophants barely scraped together a quorum. Her kingdom was crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. I watched it all unfold from my porch, sipping coffee, flipping through a growing stack of news articles and legal notices with quiet satisfaction. Because Karen might have had the HOA by the throat once, but now the county, the city, the news, and the law had her by the ankles, dragging her down 1 inch at a time. She'd built her empire on arrogance and asphalt, poured her false confidence into concrete, and in doing so, she'd forgotten the most basic rule of all: nature always wins. This time, it was going to win in spectacular fashion. The first set of city citations hit like a thunderclap, thick envelopes stuffed into every HOA board member's mailbox, each bearing official government letterhead and sharp legal language. Karen's face when she opened hers was priceless, as something I would have paid good money to see. But the real show came later that afternoon, when the city posted the first red tags on a dozen homes' front doors, including mine. Her house was tagged, unsafe structure, unstable foundation, immediate occupancy restrictions pending remediation. In plain English, their dream homes had been declared unlivable. I sat on my porch, watching families stand dumbstruck in the rain, staring at the bright orange warning placards as if they couldn't quite grasp what was happening. Within days, moving vans clogged the streets, engines rumbling as bewildered homeowners scrambled to salvage what they could from houses slowly sinking into the earth like shipwrecks in slow motion. Karen fought back. Of course, she hired a lawyer, threatened to sue the city, yelled at inspectors in her driveway until her voice cracked. But it was no use. The damage was obvious, the evidence overwhelming, the paper trail of negligence too thick to ignore. The final blow came from the insurance companies. When the first claims arrived for water damage, foundation collapse, and mold remediation, the adjusters swooped in like vultures, picking the carcasses clean. Act of negligence, they said. Policy violations. Failure to maintain proper drainage. Denied, denied, denied. No payouts, no repairs, no hope. Without insurance money, homeowners were trapped. Their properties were worthless, their mortgages draining them dry. Foreclosure notices started appearing in windows like paper ghosts. Karen's own home, once the pride of the neighborhood with manicured hedges and faux Greek columns, was the first condemned outright. By month's end, she was living in a borrowed RV parked at the far edge of the development, its wheels slowly sinking into the very mud she'd unleashed. The HOA collapsed soon after. At an emergency meeting held in the gutted shell of the community center, the handful of remaining residents voted to dissolve the organization. No fanfare, no speeches, just a bitter majority raised in rain-soaked hands. Karen tried to object, but no one even bothered to argue. She was finished and she knew it. The final financial report was read aloud in a voice so hollow it might as well have been a funeral dirge. Over $2.3 million in projected legal liabilities. Zero assets. Bankruptcy imminent. A motion was made, seconded, and approved to dissolve the HOA immediately. Karen was last seen dragging boxes of shredded documents out of the community center under the watchful eye of a city marshal. But the story didn't end there. Even as the home met its well-deserved death, the neighborhood faced a choice: try to patch the broken system the old way or return to the land's original wisdom. The vote to restore the natural drainage passed with nearly no opposition. The county environmental office offered grants for watershed restoration. Volunteers lined up to help. Even some displaced homeowners who once snubbed me pitched in. For weeks, we dug, shoveled, and planted, peeling back concrete scars to reveal the soft, thirsty earth beneath. We rerouted the water along its old path, and not with pipes, pumps, and asphalt, but with native grasses, willow trees, and carefully placed stones. The first time the creek flowed again, clear and laughing through my backyard, it felt like hearing an old friend calling my name after a long absence. I sat beside it, legs dangling in the cool rush of water, smiling as dragonflies returned. Frogs croaked in the reeds, and the land itself seemed to exhale in relief. But I wasn't quite finished. One sunny morning, while the neighborhood bustled with rebuilding and renewal, I planted a small wooden sign at the creek's head, where it curved into my property. I carved the letters myself, slow and deliberate, until the message stood clean and bold for anyone passing by to see. Nature always wins. It wasn't spite. It wasn't gloating. It was truth, pure and simple. For all their rules and fines, concrete and arrogance, they'd forgotten the oldest law of all. No matter how high you build your walls, no matter how many papers you sign or stamps you press, you cannot conquer the land forever. It remembers. It waits. And when the time is right, it reclaims what is its own. Karen left shortly after, towing her battered RV behind a rusted pickup with a cracked rear window. No farewell party, no parade, just a few curious glances and many relieved sighs. The house she once lorded over now sits abandoned, half swallowed by the very swamp she helped create, a monument to hubris and stupidity. The new families who moved in never asked much about the past. They saw the restored creek, the lush wetlands, the healthy trees and thriving gardens, and were content to let the land tell its own story, a better story, a lasting one. Every so often, I still find myself sitting by the creek, watching water dance over the stones, listening to frogs sing at sunset, feeling the earth solid and sure beneath my boots. I run my fingers over the rough wood of the sign and smile, because I know what it cost to win this peace, and I know that no matter what comes next, and no matter who tries to tame it, own it, or reshape it, the land will endure. It will remember. It will win, just like it always has.